Thank you very much. Thank you, Tony. Next slide, please. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And I know that our time is limited, so I will go directly into my presentation. And first, I would like to give you a quick update in the industry safety performance during the first half of 2020. And briefly introduce our safety risk management framework. After that, I will discuss the activities that we have undertaken with regulators to manage the big challenges presented by COVID-19 in terms of managing things such as crew licenses and certificates during the shutdowns and quarantines. And lastly, I will briefly summarize how we responded to the impact of the pandemic on our IOSA and ISEGO audit programs. Next slide, please. What you see on the screen is the mid-year update of 2020 accidents as classified by the IATA Accident Classification Technical Group. As you can see on the screen, from the 1st of January through the 30th of June, there were a total of 20 accidents, out of which 2 were fatal with 100 onboard fatalities. We should remember that for all of 2019, there were 53 accidents, of which 8 were fatal, resulting in 240 onboard fatalities. We also have to note that the downing of Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 by a ground-to-air missile is not included in these figures, as this event is not classified as an accident. And we should also keep in mind that after February 2020, the number of flights declined dramatically owing to COVID-19 related service reductions. Next slide, please. However, as you can see here, indicated by the green arrows, most regions experienced an improvement in the accident rate in the first half of 2020. But 3 regions saw an increase in the accident rate, indicated by the red arrows that you can see on the screen. The accident rate takes into account the number of flights operated, so it gives a clearer picture of the industry's performance against long-term trends. Next slide, please. Here you see the overall global safety performance of the industry since 2011 up through the first half of 2020, this year. And this graph shows a continued reduction in accidents when considering a rolling 5-year average rate. And I certainly realize that the chart can be hard to follow. So for those who want the exact figures, they are contained in our safety fact sheet, which will be posted to the IATA press room right after this event. Next one, please. Next slide. Thank you. COVID-19 has introduced multiple changes as the airline industry has had to adapt itself to operations during the pandemic. And it is paramount, really paramount, that management of change to be considered within the context of the operator's safety management system. And the industry, the airlines have been implementing the safety management system elements for several years now, and it is also included in the IOSA program. The COVID-19 safety risk management framework you see on the screen acts as a repository to support industry decision-making on the identification and management of safety risks. And multiple groups working with IATA and ICAO and other organizations have captured and documented safety risks unique, and I would like to emphasize, unique to these extraordinary times. And as a result, safety risk assessments were conducted and guidance material and operational notices published and webinars delivered as well. At present, we are using this framework internally to identify risks, set restart priorities, and produce documents such as the ones that I just mentioned, of course, but the plan is to make it public in the future for all IATA airline members. Next one, please. Next slide. Here are just some examples of guidance materials that were developed by IATA in response to the challenges of COVID-19. And you will be able to find these and several others in the IATA's website, in our website. Next slide, please. I would like now to address how we have worked with ICAO and state regulators to address some of the unique challenges that have arisen as a result of lockdowns and border closures. Next slide, please. One of the biggest challenges which regulators and airlines soon recognized was the need for temporary measures to ensure that licenses and certificates critical to managing aviation safety were extended during a period when the ability of pilots to renew licenses and certificates was heavily compromised owing to the impact of COVID, including mobility restrictions and reduction in flying hours. And this was vital to ensure that aircraft operations could continue. And therefore, IATA supported ICAO to define alternative pilot training and operational standards with the goal to manage the crisis period while ensuring that safety was not compromised. IATA has published 5 pilot guidance documents to support airlines and training organizations and help them to manage pilot training and licensing during COVID. The IATA documents have been positively received and endorsed by regulators. For example, the IATA virtual classroom guidance content has been considered as an acceptable mean of compliance by EASA. And another example, the IATA training solutions for the restart of operations have been endorsed by the ICAO Flight Operations Panel. And these documents provide practical elements to implement a competency-based approach for pilot training in order to ensure safe and efficient operation during COVID and the restart of operations. And it also has applicability, why not, to our future pilot training after we emerge from the current crisis. Next slide, please. As individual states granted alleviations, it was very important that these temporary measures were recognized by other states in order to be fully in compliance with the provisions of the Chicago Convention. The IATA COVID-19 contingency related differences tool, the CCRD, is a joint effort by IATA and ICAO to monitor states' alleviation measures submitted to ICAO. Because it is particularly important to have visibility into the states that may have restrictions in place for foreign operators, flight crew members who have been granted alleviations to their own pilot licenses or certificates. As of today, the tool shows the information input to the ICAO CCRD coming from more than 200 states or territories. But really work in this area continues. And next steps are the development of guidance on returning back to normal to support ICAO's efforts on how the flight crew can be treated as key workers and therefore be part of the public health corridor concept to allow training and medical certification activities and not be subject to quarantine measures. This will be very important in the near future. We have also assisted in the development of the ICAO Quick Reference Guides, which covers a range of areas such as air operations, licensing, airworthiness, etc. And they are complementary in helping support business continuity by addressing safety risks that may originate, that may be a result of changes introduced as part of the COVID-19 alleviations. Next slide, please. In the aircraft maintenance area, IATA has been in close coordination with the ICAO Airworthiness Panel. And 3 ICAO Quick Reference Guides were developed in this area. And IATA worked with operators, OEMs, and regulators to reduce the maintenance burden for parked aircraft. Thousands of parked aircraft, like never before. And produce the so-called guidance for managing aircraft during long storage. This has been a very, very useful document. Results of this work have helped the industry. For example, to save over, we estimate, $250 million by alleviating the costly periodic non-revenue flight requirements associated with long-term parking. And we also work to help ensure the prevention of fuel degradation during extended aircraft parking. And with thousands of passenger aircraft, thousands of those aircraft being put back into service to carry cargo only, we also work with regulators on safety issues and develop a guidance manual named Guidance for the Transport of Cargo and Mail on Aircraft Configured for the Carriage of Passengers. Another very useful document as reported by the airlines. Next one, please. Thank you. We also developed the IATA Health Safety Checklist for air operators to be used as a self-assessment tool which incorporates the ICAO CART guidance provisions as well as guidance provided by key regulators. The checklist, we are sure, is an important instrument to demonstrate the commitment of IATA members to a safe and healthy passenger journey and an employee working environment. Next slide, please. Now I would like to quickly review how we adapted the IATA Operational Safety Audit, the IOSA, and the IATA Safety Audit for Ground Operations, ISEGO, to the new realities created by COVID-19. Next slide, please. The initial relief measures implemented in March provided extra time of up to 180 days for solutions to be assessed, agreed, and implemented. As a result of this, and owing to travel restrictions and loss of service, some audits that had come due needed to be postponed. And to account for the audit postponements, we introduced bi-monthly questionnaires that provided up-to-date information on airline and ground service provider operations and business continuity measures. Then, a few months later, in July, we introduced new auditing methods, basically remote auditing to circumvent the travel restrictions and to perform interim assessments. The remote audits were also made more affordable, but not being on site, not having to pay travel expenses, and by focusing the assessment on critical items. And we provided guidance and training to all involved airlines, ground service providers, and auditors as well. The first remote audit took place in August, and since then, we have worked hard to reschedule the audits to fit in with massive, really massive airline operational and resource changes. The audits are overseen, as always, by our quality department, and I'm pleased to say the report is that auditors and auditees are coping well with the new processes. Next slide, please. But how are we doing? In IATA, the numbers are so far holding up, including 17 new IATA registrations this year. 17 new airlines that are coming into the IATA system. We have given additional time owing to extenuating circumstances, the 180-day extension that I just mentioned before, to 160 airlines. We expect 28 audits to be conducted remotely and 83 on-site audits by the end of 2020. And this makes a total of 111 IATA audits this year. Next slide, please. It is a similar picture in ISEGO. The audits due for renewal this year were given extenuating circumstances to arrange on-site audits if travel was possible or remotely if not possible. A total of 105 ISEGO audits will be done by the end of 2020. Next slide, please. So this brings me to the end of my presentation, and now I'm happy to take any questions that you may have, and I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Back to you, Tony. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Gilberto. We've got a couple questions in the queue, so I would encourage anyone who has a question on the important issues concerning safety to please submit them. We'll start with a question about the use of disinfectants on aircraft, which have increased over the course of the COVID crisis as airlines are disinfecting cabins more frequently. The questioner asks, what has IATA's involvement been in either the assessment or commenting or communicating guidance on the use of disinfectants and potential corrosion issues?
Yeah, this is a very important topic. And since the very beginning of the crisis, we have issued guidance for disinfection of the aircraft cabin, not only the cabin, the passenger cabin, but the cockpit as well, the pilot cockpit, because as mentioned, the use of disinfectants had to be very carefully done with only the proper approved substances, because it could create problems like corrosion, for example. Of course, these cleaning materials have been in use in the airlines for many years, but not as frequent as they are being used now, in some cases several times during the same day. So this frequent use was not envisioned in the past when they were approved. So we have provided, and this is even more critical in the cockpit, where they could damage, let's say, navigation equipment, communication equipment, etc., etc. So we, of course, have issued this guidance for the airlines, but we have been in close collaboration with the authorities, especially with the certification authorities of the aircraft, to redesign the protocols and to carefully be sure that the way the application of these disinfectants is done is done in the proper way. So we have worked a lot, but we are continuing to working on that because these process is taking longer than expected. And of course, if we have been doing this application of disinfectants for 6 months, and we might need to do it for another 6 months or more, who knows? That could create a problem. This is a serious problem. We are taking care of that, and we are working with especially with the OEMs, the manufacturers, and the certification authorities, the certification of aircraft authorities involved on this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Gilberto. We have another question about the extension of licenses over the COVID period. Are you concerned that as the crisis drags on, this could be creating issues for when the industry comes back to operating?
Yes, and of course we have been very careful on doing that. You know, the extension of licenses and certificates has to be complemented with some mitigation measures. For example, if you have a pilot that, just as an example, if you have a pilot whose license has been extended, you need to combine that pilot with another pilot that the license has not been extended or that has had recently some recurrent training, for example, etc., etc. There are many mitigation measures that you can apply considering the extension of licenses. But of course, this cannot be forever. And we understand, and we have made great progress, by the way, now, because what we have seen, and we just did some research in the industry just about a month ago, and we found that 80%, actually 81, 82% of the operators in a worldwide global scale were already being able to comply with the requirements to renew licenses, certificates, training, etc. So there has been a great, progress on this area, and this is why I believe that this extension of licenses will not go beyond March, the end of March this next year, which is the deadline or the final date that we discussed with ICAO, and it was implemented by ICAO through a state letter delivered a few months ago. So I think that this is coming to an end, considering the data that we have, and it shouldn't go beyond the end of March next year. So far, the measures that we have taken to mitigate the risk have worked well, we believe. This is what we have from the data, but it cannot be unlimited. There has to be an end of this, and I think we are approaching to the end. Thank you, Tony.
Okay, thanks, Gilberto. Just a clarification on that. What happens after March if the crisis continues?
We need to, definitely we will need to implement something, but on a case-by-case basis, meaning every single case, every single airline will have to be evaluated, and with the work of the Civil Aviation Authority the relevant one, I mean their own Civil Aviation Authority, and to be decided what is the additional mitigation measures that will have to be implemented. What we did initially 6-7 months ago is ICAO actually, we working with ICAO, deliver kind of a blanket authorization asking the Civil Aviation Authorities to grant facilities, to grant, flexibility to that. But time has passed, and now we have to be more precise and more detailed on what we do. And definitely, if there is something needed after March, Tony, it will have to be very carefully analyzed on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, thanks, Gilberto. We have a question about the 2020 first half safety performance. There were some regions that saw safety performance decline in the first half of the year. And the questioner says specifically North America, Europe, and MENA. And the question is there any, first off, are the declines significant? And if so, are there any reasons behind that?
We have to remember that this is a number coming from the number of, it's a rate, it's the number of accidents per million sectors flown per million flights. So, we had less activity in 2020, but this is a rate. So it is not affected by that. We haven't been able to find any specific reasons for these increases or reductions in the rate of accident. It seems to be just the natural evolution of the industry. Sometimes you have more accidents here, sometimes you have more accidents or less accidents there. So it doesn't seem to be any specific root cause, especially related with the COVID-19 crisis. It's just the natural evolution of the industry. And we see that every year. We see some regions that are going down. We see some regions that are going up. This is why the global average is the global average, and the 5-year average is the best way to measure the evolution on this on a global scale, because if you measure one specific region or one specific short period of time, 1 year, you may get some confusing information, I would say, Tony. I don't know if I'm answering the question. Thank you.
Yep, no, great. Thank you very much, Gilberto. We have some questions about training, and it's basically saying, have we seen training programs, pilot training programs, perhaps recurrent training programs, suffer or need to take alternative measures because there are so few aircraft flying at this time?
Yes, of course. And this is even more critical in the airlines that do not have their own, let's say, simulator training facilities, and they need to pay someone else to do these activities, and sometimes in another countries, crossing borders. And this is why it has been very difficult for many airlines to cope with that. Some of the airlines have, let's say, taken the option of training in the aircraft, the real aircraft, which can be done, but it's very, very expensive. Some other airlines have been, let's say, have taken the decision to take their crews to another country and stay there in a quarantine for 14 days in a hotel, and then go and take the training, which also increases the cost substantially and also reduces the availability of their own crew members. And also with the lack of enough flying hours, many of the pilots have been suffering of that. And as a pilot, if you don't fly for a certain number of days, then you have to go to training to fly again. So you can imagine that with the reduction of international flights of 90%, for example, at this moment, thousands and thousands of pilots have lost recency, as we call it, because they don't fly enough. So in order to fly again, they need to go to training. So it's a big problem. There have been many solutions implemented. As we mentioned, the extensions that have been granted by the states in many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases. So it has been a combination of multiple solutions that have been implemented. And the good news is that so far the industry have performed very well on these extraordinary times in this specific, very critical, safety critical challenge that we have faced recently. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Gilberto. We have another question on training and guidance materials. So IATA has published several types of guidance, including for crew, for baggage handlers, etc. Has there been any guidance published for ground operations staff
yes.
to ensure that their safety? Yeah.
Yes. There is at least 2 documents on that, and you can find them on the web page. And let me tell you that this has been very critical, because with this crisis, the ground service provider area, the ground service providers area has suffered a lot. They have lost a lot of personnel, They have had to furlough a lot of personnel of their own personnel, because their own people, because they don't have flights, they don't have business, so they cannot maintain the machine running, I will say. So this is a safety critical element, and this is why we have insisted in protocols to do the ground handling procedures properly, but also in protocols to train as soon as possible new people, a lot of new people that are coming into the system because of the turnover that is being produced by this COVID-19. So the answer is yes, we are providing this type of support, of course. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Gilberto. We have a question about ground damage and ground incidents. The questioner says that there's a perceived increase in news reporting around ground incidents this year, such as when aircraft are being towed, coming in contact with other parked aircraft, etc. So the first is this a correct perception? Second is, if so, if it is the case, what is behind it? And third, what is IATA doing about it?
Yeah, let me mention, Tony, that we perceive that we have our ground damage database in IATA, part of the Global Aviation Data Management System. We have detected some increase, but it's not even globally speaking. Some airlines, some states, so it doesn't seem to be a global problem. It seems to be more related to the specific situation of a ground service provider, of an airline, or both, in which the lack of enough personnel or new personnel coming into it, not properly trained with the procedures, etc. It's a combination of factors that are participating here. This is why, and in relation with the previous question and answer, this is why we have insisted on the need to properly train the people as soon as possible, but before they come into the operational side. So this is what we are doing, insisting on that with the operators, with the civil aviation authorities, because we agree, we have detected that. It's not a massive problem so far. It's not a massive problem, but there are some indications of increase of ground damage in some parts of the industry, not from a global perspective, Tony.
Great, thank you very much. We had the good news of the recertification of the 737 in the U.S. market, but it hasn't been certified for reintroduction in all parts of the world at the same time. Two parts to the question. One is, does IATA have any concerns about this sort of staggered return to service? And secondly, in terms of the review of the 737 process, does IATA have any concerns or any learnings from that process?
Thank you very much. Yes, we were probably a year ago, we knew that this staggered return to service was going to happen, mainly because of regulations. Once the aircraft, any aircraft, is, let's say, clear, authorized to go to service or return to service, this is the starting point of a process that starts in the other states that which airlines are going to operate the aircraft. This is the way it happens all the time. First, the certificating authority, and then the other civil aviation authorities around, and some authorities have shorter or longer procedures, legal processes to follow to grant the final authorization to operate on that country. So we knew that was coming. Of course, a year ago, that was a big concern because the industry urgently needed those aircraft because of the demand that we had in 2019. I'm not saying that this is a good thing, but of course, with the situation we have now and the strong reduction on demand, this problem is not that big at this moment. I'm not saying that it's not a problem, but it's not that big because in the end, the demand for aircraft is not as high as it was 1 year ago. So for good or for bad, the pressure for having a simultaneous returning to service of the 737 MAX everywhere is not as high as this moment. But of course, if some of the airlines may not return their aircraft back to fly very soon because they don't need them anyway. Some of the airlines may decide that because of their strategy, etc., because of the improvement in fuel consumption. For example, the 737 MAX has a strong reduction in fuel consumption and CO2 emissions, etc. So I would say that most of the airlines will decide to take it back to flying as soon as possible. So as soon as possible, we are urging the authorities to, authorize the return to service following the FAA initial authorization as soon as possible. And there are second part of the question, many lessons that we can learn from that, from this very unfortunate situation of the 737 MAX. For example, we learned that, there is a long history of collaboration between certificating authorities, FAA with the others, EASA with the FAA, or the Brazilian authority, or the Canadian authority, or the Chinese authority, all the authorities, the Russians that certify aircraft. And they are used to work together pretty much. Okay, this crisis is telling us, this is the IATA position, that it's good that they do it, but it's not enough. We need to get the authorities even closer together among themselves and closer to ICAO to speed up the processes and to collaborate better with each other, not only to recertify an aircraft, but also to eventually detect any possible problem that is on the certification process of one authority to help them solve the problem before the aircraft goes to service. So definitely there are many lessons learned from this unfortunate situation. IATA has been very close to the authorities on this, to the airlines, and to Boeing, for example, and FAA. We organize a 737 MAX task force with the representative of most of the operators in the world. This is an active task force that continues to work and will continue to work for a few more months in the return to service process. So definitely many lessons to be learned from this, and we are working on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Gilberto. And we're just about at time, so we'll have one last question. And that question is, when the industry is ready to restart at a very large scale, what is your main concern in terms of safety?
I will say that because nobody knows exactly when that is going to be. The training part seems to be in a good situation, I would say, in a good status, because airlines, operators, authorities have found a way to keep their workforce properly trained in most of the cases, and we are getting better every day. The maintenance challenge is going to be massive. The maintenance part. Like never in history, probably. Never in history. We had, at the peak of the crisis, middle of this year, May, more than 18,000 aircraft park. 18,000 aircraft park. This is a number that is difficult to understand, difficult to believe. There were problems to find a space to park the aircraft in the airports. Many airports had to close runways to park the aircraft in the runways because there was no space. So the maintenance part of the return to service, among many others, of course, is one of the areas that we need to very carefully plan with the complexity that nobody knows when it's going to happen. Because the more time it takes, the more complex are the maintenance activities that we need to perform to the aircraft to be able to get them ready to return to service. So if I was asked, Tony, gentlemen, ladies, in my opinion, what is the biggest challenge that the industry will have on the return to service? Probably I will say the maintenance challenge. And for what I have explained, and because nobody knows when exactly it's going to happen. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Gilberto. That was very clear. We've got no more questions in the queue, which is perfect.